Thank you for inviting me to join you. You just heard a little bit of my personal background. I am an urban planner by training, and I would say a New Yorker by choice. And as you've heard, I've spent a lot of time in big bureaucracies, whether it was the School Construction Authority, the Department of Education. I then went to the New York Presbyterian Hospital and then recently joined the YMCA. So I tell you all that to tell you that I'm sort of a sucker for bureaucracies. And tonight I want to talk a little bit about one of the largest, New York City's Department of Education. And I will give you one caveat, which is it's a very vast, complex system, and so I've curated a set of slides and information that I think are probably slightly subjective, so bear that in mind. I have three primary objectives. One is to give you an overview of size and scale. The other is to talk a bit about organization and governance. And third, because I'm a builder and because I spent so much time at the SCA, I want to talk a little bit about school development and some of the beautiful projects that were done there. So I think it's always good to start with an overview of numbers, which I think gives you that incredible sense of scale and size of New York City's education system. It's hard to capture, again, just how big DOE is, but I think if you start with that 1.1 million school kids at the center and think about everything else around it that services that. So it is 1,300 school buildings that house 1,800 schools. It's 145,000 employees, including 75,000 teachers. The system provides 1 million meals daily. There are 9,000 school buses, which is one of the reasons we have traffic in the city, transporting children. We have 5,000 school safety agents. And in fact, the school safety unit is, in essence, this country's 6th largest police department after New York City, Chicago, LA, Philadelphia, and Houston. Of those 1.1 million students, over 75% are eligible for free or reduced price lunches. So it gives you some context for the scale and again the size and who's being served. This is a current state picture, and you'll notice as I go through the slides, there are different years and different budget amounts being used. It's just because of what you can get your information, it's what I could get my hands on and how to use information as a proxy, but it's all essentially the same order of magnitude. So first, let's talk about dollars. The annual operating budget for DOE this year is $24.3 billion. And when you think about that as a component of the city's $85 million budget, again, you get that sense of scale. And when you look at it in terms of comparison to other city agencies and civic components, again, huge, significant investments being made in the lives of our children in the city. That $24 billion translates roughly into just over $19,000 per student annually, which is the highest nationwide rate. And then I wanted to give you a little more slightly granular budget information, again, very selective based on what is interesting to me, but a breakdown of the budget into personnel and some non-personnel areas. Over $15 billion goes towards covering personnel expenses. Those 9,000 school buses cost over $1 billion a year to run. Universal pre-K, which we'll come back to in a little bit, includes $800 million for pre-K, which has expanded significantly over the last several years, and another $800 million for special education pre-K contracted services. So that's why you see that $1.6 billion number. And the city spends nearly $2 billion on charter schools in New York City. Again, we'll come back to the programmatic components of that in a little bit. And because we're competitive New Yorkers, we're always trying to compare ourselves to other cities and other city budgets. Our DOE budget is more than twice the size of DC's municipal budget. Again, just a sense of scale and comparison, but quite significant. Always important to understand where dollars come from, so this is a quick recap of our funding sources, whether they're from the city, the state, or federal sources. So funds are distributed to schools in part through what's called the Fair Student Funding Process, and that allocates dollars really based on enrollment numbers and need. So it really targets resources according to student needs, and that might be around poverty, that might be around special needs. Those dollars are given to principals who have the flexibility to determine how they're spent. I want to highlight some student composition numbers. The demographics of the system are quite interesting. This is what reflects the current breakdown of students. And it's interesting to compare it to what we see in terms of citywide demographics. They're mostly on par. The Hispanic Latino student population is about 40%. That's higher than the citywide population of 24%. African American is about the same, 26.5% of students and citywide demographics. Non-Hispanic white is 14% compared to the citywide population of 33%. Asian 15% and other 2%. It's also worth noting that 12% of students enrolled in DOE are English language learners. So that means those are students whose native language is not English and require support to learn English. So that's the demographic breakdown. Interesting to also look at enrollment by boroughs and by grades. Not surprising, given that Brooklyn and Queens are our largest boroughs with the highest populations. They also have the highest representations, as you can see here. And again, very close to overall city demographics. Two key differences. Manhattan is slightly underrepresented in terms of students because the population represents about 19%, but here it's a little bit less. Staten Island is slightly overrepresented, if that's the right word. It's in terms of students, citywide is about 5%. This also, the register gives you a sense of grade distribution. So there are about 70,000 students per grade within the department. So talk a little bit about enrollment and access. And I am using the term enrollment pathways here to describe the way that students enroll in city schools. And at the elementary and middle school levels, they apply to schools primarily based on geographic zones within the city's 32 school districts. There may be some choice based on availability within and across zones, but it's predominantly geographic based. New York City's high school program is the largest choice program in the city. There are over 500 high schools that students can choose from, which really allows students to choose either local high schools or to travel across the city. And there's an assumption made that students will travel, so you're not constrained by where you live. I will hold up my own two daughters as an example. They went to their zoned elementary school in Brooklyn. They went to two different middle schools, very focused on different things. One went to a science and math middle school, one went to a performing arts middle school, and then they both came into Manhattan for high school, which was painful getting them up in the morning, but they did it. And in selecting high schools, really had to become a consumer of information about school size, around curriculum, around that commute. So it's a complex process, but it puts students, I think, in the control seat about where they want to spend time. Just a minute on gifted and talented programs. Between the ages of 3 and 7, students can take tests to access gifted and talented seats. There are only about 2,300 seats, G&T seats, throughout the city, which is small compared to the number of students who both take the tests and are eligible for them. I personally think gifted and talented is a little bit of a misnomer. It's really about accelerated learning, but that is one of those terms that's stuck around. Also wanted to spend a minute on charter schools, which have seen a dramatic increase in enrollment over the last several years. So there was a state law that was enacted in 1998 that allowed for charters, which are independent public schools, to be created. In New York, they operate a contract or a charter that runs traditionally 3 to 5 years. They can be authorized by one of 3 entities, either through the city's Department of Education, the New York State Education Department, or the State University of New York Charter Schools Institute. So those are the only 3 authorizing entities that can allow for a charter school to be created. There are over 200 charters in New York City serving over 100,000 students, which again has grown dramatically over the last 10 years and now represents about 10% of the student population. There's a cap on the number of charters, both statewide and citywide. In New York City, we have about 45 remaining charters. We'll see what happens with the state legislature as that comes up against that cap, but right now that's how many we have accessible. It's also worth mentioning a few additional pathways to educational services that students can use. So one is, as I mentioned, universal pre-K, which now enrolls 70,000 4-year-olds throughout the city. Again, tremendous growth over the last 2 years, which in part contributes to that significant budget increase you've seen over the last few years. There are 200 career and technical education programs that enroll about 60,000 students in schools like automotive tech, Aviation High School in Queens. District 75, again, an anachronistic term that's been around for probably 30, 40 years, refers to special education and inclusion programs. Those serve 24,000 students in 60 schools. And District 79 refers to alternative schools and programs, and there are approximately 15,000 students in about 169 sites citywide. Many of those kids are ages 17 through 21 who've seen some kind of interruption in schooling. So they're not necessarily traditional schools, but they really do create alternative pathways. And so I include all of this to give you, again, a sense of the broad array of programs and services available to a quite diverse set of students and student needs, and also to give you a sense of just how expansive the department is. And so there's a question, right? When you have an expansive department like that, how do you manage it? And that is one thing that has been both a challenge and an opportunity for many years. So to talk about this, I think it's important to go back in time and take a quick look about what the structure was and how it was changed. About 50 years ago, the Board of Education was created with 32 local elected school districts that managed all the elementary and middle schools. High schools rolled up under the Board of Education under a sort of central oversight. The Board of Education had 7 members. The mayor was able to appoint 2, and each borough appointed 1. So that gives you 7, and you can do the math on how you get to a majority there. It was very complicated. That Board of Education selected the chancellor. The mayor could influence the system through the budget process, but as you can imagine, power was quite dispersed and very localized, and it was very hard to figure out who to hold accountable. Before mayoral control, it's worth noting that the city's 4-year graduation rate was hovering about 50% for many, many years. No progress. And that is what really led in part to mayoral control and the changes in 2002, when then Mayor Mike Bloomberg lobbied quite successfully the state legislature for the ability to take control of New York City's school system, which was known as mayoral control, and it gave the mayor much greater authority over all the decisions directly affecting the city school system. So that included who sat on that Board of Education, how to appoint and let go of the school chancellor if need be, and to close schools that were underperforming. All of those decisions were really difficult to do before mayoral control was enacted. Current mayoral control was recently extended to 2019. You remember last year that there was a vote that was extended through 2019. So that's an overview of the governance. This is what the current DOE organizational chart looks like. It is big. But remember, you got, again, 145,000 employees, 75,000 students, and 1,800 schools. So you have several deputy chancellors with quite significant portfolios. So everything from the operations group that looks at pupil transportation, school food, school safety, division of school facilities, health and wellness, all within one portfolio, very significant portfolios, and then several administrative officers. And it's an interesting question around how do you create and craft a bureaucracy that can balance the need between centralizing standards and information that needs to be shared across the system and giving local control. And this structure is really geared towards doing that, right? Making sure that where there needs to be consistent quality and standards, whether it's curriculum standards, custodial services, that those are developed at the central level and then implemented on the local level. These kinds of decisions were made much easier with mayoral control. So it's hard to talk about accountability and governance of the DOE without making it a little bit of a word salad. And so let me talk you through some of the terms that you may have heard of. So today, that Board of Education is gone. It's the Department of Education. The department is overseen by the PEP, or Panel for Educational Policy. And today that consists of 13 members. It used to be 7, now it's 13. 5 appointed by borough presidents to ensure representation, 8 appointed by the mayor, including the chancellor. That PEP meets monthly to review policy, to review school opening and closure decisions, what's called significant changes in school utilization. Those are the reasons that PEP meetings take a very long time. You may remember in the past, sometimes they would go till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning as you worked through each of those decisions. So that's the PEP. There are also 32 community education councils, which are elected. Those mirror or replace the school districts. There are also 4 citywide education councils, one for high schools, one for English language learners, one for special ed, one for District 75. Each of those, each CEC, each district is overseen by a superintendent. I think it's worth just noting what the responsibilities of the CEC are, right? So the PEP is really governing board. The CEC tends to be more advisory, but it does approve local zoning changes. Again, local elected positions, those councils also meet monthly. And I included on this slide two other entities worth noting. One is the Council of School Administrators. That's your principals and your vice principals, assistant principals. And then the UFT, the United Federation of Teachers, which is 200,000 members. That includes current teachers and current teachers and retirees. So this is probably as close to pedagogy or instruction as I'll get, but I wanted to give you a sense of, so now you have a structure. You've got some governance, you've got to figure out a strategic plan or a theory of action. And I just included two that I think, one which governed 12 years of the Bloomberg administration and one which I think will govern the next several years of education in the city. So under Bloomberg, Children's First was the name of that theory of, I call it a theory of action, that was the strategic plan, and which included a couple of key principles around empowerment, leadership, and accountability. Empowering principals, putting them in charge of their schools, creating leadership opportunities, making sure people had the leadership skills they need, and holding schools accountable. You may remember school report cards. The MMR was created, which I'll talk about in a minute, but those sorts of things were quite important. The other key component here was that small schools movement, which really increased dramatically over 10 years. I think there were maybe 400 or 500 schools created. Currently, we have Equity and Excellence for All, which has these three pillars: academic excellence, which UPK, Universal Pre-K, is an example of something that falls within that. Community and renewal schools, which are receiving extra support, is a part of that student and community support. And the support structure for schools is now based in what are called field support centers that are new. That's considered an innovation that went into effect last year. That's really about housing school support locally for parents, for families, for schools, again, consistently across the board. Accountability, very important. And I mentioned the need for large bureaucracies really to be structured in a way for an efficient delivery of services, but they also need to be held accountable. And that's what this does. This is the Mayor's annual MMR, Mayor's Management Report. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to spend some time with it. You'll learn more about what's happening in the city and how resources are allocated and what the city's overall goals are than anything else. It is wonky. And it's good if you can't sleep, but it will give you the most complete overview of goals and activities, and this is where the DOE has to report annually on how it's doing in terms of performance. And so I just wanted to share with you some of those very important measurements and the metrics that we look at in terms of understanding, are we being successful, are we making progress? And certainly one important one is graduation rates. And this really, I think, gives you quite a dramatic sense of the progress and the improvement that's been made over time in terms of graduation rates, in terms of Regents diplomas being awarded. So just, I should note that high school students earn New York Regents diplomas, which require certain levels of study and exams. Most high schools require a Regents diploma. So you are seeing, I think, incremental progress over time. It's also worth noting that you're seeing improvements made across the board by all demographic groups, which is important. So you're seeing graduation rates increase and dropout rates decrease, which is an indication of progress, which is great for this city. At the same time, we've also been paying a lot of attention to college and career readiness. And in recent years, really honing in on that and realizing that there's still significant work to do. So these are based on math and reading proficiency exams, and you can see that if these are an indication for how students will fare in college and whether remediation is necessary, again, some significant work to do. So improvements being made, but still clearly an opportunity for growth and better work. So now let me talk a little bit about the SCA, something near and dear to my heart. I was there from 2006 to 2010, and a minute on its history and evolution. So it's really the capital arm right now of the Department of Education. It was created in 1988 as a state authority, really to expedite construction through somewhat more flexible procurement rules. And so, for example, the SCA is not subject to WICS laws, but that has to be renewed every 5 years, but it did give it more flexibility. And when it was set up, it was really just about the construction implementation. The Board of Ed oversaw the capital planning and the development of architectural plans, but then the SCA implemented. When mayoral control came in 2002, the mandate of the SCA changed, and it became really the full agency that handles all of the capital planning, all of the design, all of the management, and the implementation of the capital plan. It is in the midst of a 5-year, $15.5 billion capital plan, the largest in its history, I think the largest in the city, and probably the largest in the country. It's also a significant component of the city's overall capital budget. So the plan is governed by a 5-year capital plan that's I still talk about that, that has to be updated annually. The dollars for the plan are allocated into 3 primary buckets. So the first is around capacity or new seats, and that's driven by annual demographic data. We look every year and we work with city planning to understand where are we going to see growth, in what neighborhoods, what are the demands going to be, where are their capacity issues. That's that first bucket. The second is around capital investment or renovation requirements, and that is determined by what we call BCAS, Building Condition Assessment Surveys. There's a lot of acronyms, but annually we send a team of engineers and architects out to schools to take a look, and so you're using objective information across the board to determine what schools need resources. That's that second bucket, and the third is around mandated programs. So that might be about code changes, the need to sprinkler schools. It might be about emergencies that come up. So a couple of things worth noting in the new capacity piece, that's the new schools, $4.5 billion in new schools. That's where you get some of the significant numbers that you'll see in a minute about new school development. $3.8 billion in that capital improvement bucket program. Remember, there are 1,300 school buildings. Many of them are 70 to 80 years old. I think the average age of the overall portfolio was something like 69 years old. So significant work that has to happen in schools to keep them modernized. An interesting note, in the last 10 years, the city has utilized what's called the Education Construction Fund to enable mixed-use developments, I think predominantly, if not exclusively, in Manhattan, where there were sites with additional development capacity. And so there were several projects that came about that resulted in replacing older schools, creating mixed-use developments and additional housing, and then creating an opportunity for payments to the city, pilot payments to the city over time. So a couple of examples of that. And it's also, I think, worth noting some of the innovation that has happened in the city over the last several years. So the SCA opened last year its first net zero energy school on Staten Island. I think it was the first in the region. There was a couple of mixed use developments that I talked about, so schools that were embedded into mixed use developments, which is important. A couple of interesting things around climate change and making sure that we were swapping out oil burning boilers. And worth also noting that in every new school there's a component that goes through the Public Art for Public Schools piece, which means that all new schools have these beautiful pieces of art in them. And so this is the money shot, I think. This is a snapshot of just how much has been done in the last 10 years. A huge amount of work that has had just a profound impact on communities across the city and the physical landscape of the city. So this gives you an overall sense of scale. 107,000 new school seats created in the last 10 years, over 200 new school buildings, and almost 5,000 projects completed. And most of those projects are completed in existing schools, around existing programs. You can imagine some of the logistics that have to happen there. I would say if you're interested, so along 4th Avenue in Brooklyn, for example, if you start at Barclays and drive all the way to the Verrazano Bridge, you will see schools from every decade that have been developed, and you'll get a sense of the architectural changes over time. It's someone someday will write something about it, but if you have the time, get on your bike and go down. And I thought I'd close actually with some visual reminders of what school development can do for communities. So this is a couple of pictures of some recent schools. So one is a Sunset Park High School, which opened in 2010, 2011. It was the first high school in that neighborhood. A huge victory for the community that had been pushing for it for many, many, many years. In the middle is the Mott Haven Educational Complex. I think the largest project that has ever been completed by the SCA. It's 4 schools. It sits on a 7-acre site in the Bronx that sat on old rail yards that had been empty for 50 years, needed massive remediation. I think we spent maybe $20 million just to remediate the site, but it had been vacant. And now it's a thriving school with a football field, no less. But just an indication, I think, of the power of combining both great design and great buildings with really terrific improvements internally and academically, and so now you've got this thriving campus. So a good example, I think, of the power of both joining the SCA and the DOE together and being very focused on student success. So that's my overview. Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.